Hello and welcome to another edition of our podcast, Recycle, Don't Be a Waster, run by waster.com.au. And as usual, we will cover one of the hot topics in the world of recycling and waste management. Today's episode really follows on from a video we posted a couple of weeks ago that had some listener response, and that was how de-industrialization and the increasing outsourcing of manufacturing in many developed countries is having real long-lasting impacts and detrimental impacts on the ability to recycle in these countries. So I suppose to summarize really the issue we're talking about is probably since the 1950s and 60s in many countries such as Western Europe, North America and Australia, of course, manufacturing, heavy industry, whether shipbuilding, car manufacturing, really any sort of manufacturing whatsoever, has just decreased. The factories, and you'll know this from visiting any former industrial city, whether in the UK, many areas in the north of England, the famous Rust Belt in the United States, and also in Australia, where we've got former industrial cities such as Geelong, and certainly even light manufacturing in areas of Sydney. The manufacturing really has decreased to a level whereby those industrial areas have collapsed. And that's led to a number of economic changes in those areas. The first will be clearly throughout the 70s and 80s, a real demographic impact, a real hard times for a lot of the former industrial workers. And thankfully over time we have had new industries, new service industries, etc. grow up from that. But this trend, it's not stopping, it's not even stabilizing, it seems to even be accelerating. Even in the last 5-6 years, Australia has ended all car manufacturing. So the traditional big operators in Australia, Holden and Ford, have moved overseas for all manufacturing. And with that, you have the spill-on effects of components, other parts, anybody who fed into that finished product with sub-products or parts, they also have probably gone out of business and been hugely hurt. So this trend, it goes on, and of course with that, with the economic rise of China and East Asia over the last 20 years, a huge proportion of the materials we consume in Western countries, including Australia, a huge percentage of these are fundamentally manufactured in lower cost economies, such as China, and basically exported to us. So we consume them, we probably get lower prices, and that has been a great story for, I suppose, consumers in countries like Australia over the last period, 20 years or whatever it is. But there's an old saying that every cloud has a silver lining. I suppose what's the opposite of that? Every silver cloud has a dark shadow as well on the edge. And with this outsourcing or cheaper prices, we're facing considerable problems with recycling. So if you look at what, I suppose if you've read the news or watched the television over the last number of years, you'd probably be aware of a concept of a recycling crisis in many countries. Recycling's in crisis, or we don't know what to do with these recyclable commodities, or we're stockpiling glass, or we're dumping perfectly good recycling materials at landfill, or we're examining the concept of incineration as a method to get some value from that material through energy. So what is driving all these issues is, I suppose to a large extent you can argue that as we consume more and more, as predominantly plastic is a larger part of the materials we consume. With this, over time, we're consuming more items. We're probably throwing out more items in this, short-lived consumer society that we live in. But as we throw them out, we need to find a solution for them, and that's either recycling or whatever it is. But over the last 30 years, as we've outsourced our manufacturing, we also had at the time, seemingly good idea, which in retrospect is probably a very poor idea, of also exporting our waste and recycling to the same countries who are manufacturing the products in the same regard. So you could almost view it as the container ships were coming to Australia full of finished products, and then they were heading back to China or whatever the manufacturing country was, full of waste products or recycling. This has And those countries were then recycling them into new products or new materials that then this circle could continue. China specifically has really put a clamp down on this probably about 2 or 3 years ago, which threw a lot of these countries, United States, Australia, Western Europe, into real recycling problems. If you've no one to export this recycling materials to, and you don't have your own domestic recycling plants, you can see the problem quite quickly. So that is where the recycling crisis has come from. It's probably brought this issue into the mainstream consciousness. But I suppose the issue we want to cover today is fundamentally the problem is caused by it's caused by not having the recycling facilities available, but fundamentally it's caused by the actual lack of a manufacturing base or an industrial base domestically. So if you think about it, when you recycle, and we'll even pick the most simple item, which could be, it's a hot day and you go into a shop and purchase a soft drink. Potentially your soft drink, you could obviously choose an aluminium can, which I would support because it's more recyclable. But let's say you pick a plastic bottle, so a plastic bottle of Coca-Cola or whatever your favorite soft drink is. You drink that drink, and then you do the right thing and you put the empty bottle into the recycling bin. That product then will go to, in theory, it would be recycled. It would be recycled into a new product, and that product would potentially go to maybe manufacture a new bottle. So there will likely be a bottling plant somewhere in your city, in a capital city in Sydney, and that will be a virtuous, an efficient recycling system. But it relies on, of course, having the recycling facility in the city and also having an actual manufacturing plant to take that recycled plastic and utilize it. So when you look at, that's a good example, but let's take a bad example. So say you buy a more industrial product, some metal of some sort of type, maybe that goes into car manufacturing. As the car is being, recycled or taken apart at the junkyard, the components which are taken out of that machine, there is nobody, as our industrial base has collapsed, the recycling facilities domestically, there aren't as many, and secondly, there's nobody actually to take that recycled material. If it is recycled in Australia, there's nobody domestically to actually take it because we've outsourced or seen all those factories and everything move overseas. So without the actual industrial base, the whole, I suppose, economic argument for recycling domestically, it really decreases. At the end of the day, there's not much point in keeping things out of landfill and recycling them if in theory nobody ever uses them. Are we just going to stockpile them in a corner? So without that manufacturing base, if you keep producing and consuming items, keep producing rubbish, in theory keep recycling it, but if there's no one to take it, then we run into huge issues. In some commodity markets, there are internationally traded recycling markets, and specifically I think of the cardboard market, where it's traded internationally, it's an easily used material, and also you have still manufacturing in Australia for cardboard. So it's a very efficient market, it works effectively. Aluminium for cans also works the same. But when you get into significant other markets, particularly sometimes of plastic or industrial products, there just is not the actual end taker in this country or many developed nations to actually utilize it. So we get into this issue again of, do we export it to a third party? So whereas China and other countries have clamped down on accepting recyclable materials, do we get into a situation of actually exporting finished or recycled materials? So rather than exporting plastic junk, we're recycling the plastic and then we're shipping that, not as good as new, but high quality recycled plastic overseas with the expectation that an end user in China or some other country will actually use it to manufacture goods. That probably would work, but obviously with that we have significant issues. Shipping it overseas costs significant money, and you have to find a market for it in a third party country. So China has its own domestic industry. They obviously have their own steel mills, their own aluminium smelting, their own plastic facilities. So why would they actually buy, Western produced recycled product to utilize in their factories? It's not as if they have a shortage of it themselves. So in many regards, we're looking at an economic situation where we are subsidizing the export of low-grade recycled materials. And, with that, you're paying into a market where there is no shortage of these materials. In many regards, there's probably an excess of them. And so to get rid of it without dumping it, you probably will be looking at paying, a subsidy towards the foreign company or country who's going to take that. So any way you look at it, it's not a great idea. But where do we go from here? Because there's an old saying in golf that you play the ball from where the ball lies. It's not possible to pick a perfect world. Are we going to rebuild massive infrastructure and, manufacturing and industrial, capacity in Western countries whereby we haven't had that in 20, 30 years? To be honest, it's highly unlikely. We don't have the skill set, the economics of it maybe right now don't stack up. And certainly I haven't seen any government or, regional area come up with a reindustrialization plan. Obviously, industrialization carries with it significant other environmental issues, such as pollution, greenhouse gases, all those aspects. And anybody who's lived in a formerly industrial area will be aware that when industrial activity ceases or decreases, the actual natural environment, it sees significant benefits. You'll see this in the air quality, you'll see this in the water quality, the river quality, and you'll even see news articles about the Hudson River in New York City or the Thames in London being repopulated with fish and sea life that they haven't seen in hundreds of years. And that stems directly from that deindustrialization. So as one thing benefits, we've benefited by improving our environment, but we still wanted to consume consumer products, and in many regards throw away products at the same level or even more so. But with that, we can't hide from the fact that, it always comes back to the same issue. Can we keep kidding ourselves that recycling will save the world, but without actually looking at the real, the nuts and bolts issues that recycling faces? Will we hide from the idea that I suppose for 20 years we did hide. We hid from the reality by shipping our low-grade plastic and other items that we didn't want to deal with. We dealt with that by shipping it overseas and forgetting or not caring, out of sight, out of mind. And we didn't care about what happened to it. But it made us feel better, and we didn't have to face those issues. We could then report very high recycling rates, etc. But obviously, as China develops and other countries develop, they have the economic rationale for doing this decreases hugely. There was a story, I think I saw it on the BBC website last week, whereby a Scottish recycling company, a supposed recycling company, had been shipping supposed plastic materials to China, and in reality it was found out to be literally junk, and some very disgusting junk also, such as kids' nappies and these sort of items. So it's, I suppose the countries who have been importing recycling, it's completely understandable that they want to look after their environment. It doesn't make sense to them anymore. And that market, let's be honest, is probably not going to ever reopen. So that escape valve that we've had of shipping things overseas, I don't think it will ever reopen. And to be honest, let's hope it doesn't. We have to really face a real solution to this issue. Really look at the problems, and fundamentally you have to either, I suppose if you look at it, you have a problem, you have a flow problem. You have a flow problem of like anything, like water flows in one regard, and if you don't get rid of that water, it will overflow. So in theory, we can either find ways of getting rid of the water or of decreasing the flow into the pool. Option one is we build new recycling plants in Australia and increase the industrial base to actually utilise that material. Or thirdly, we subsidise that export and pay for it to be used by other countries overseas. Either way, that is a significant financial investment. I suppose the other option, which is potentially better in my mind, is we simply decrease the amount of materials that we're utilising that cannot be reused or recycled. And fundamentally that comes down to decreasing the amount of plastic and other probably e-waste that we're accumulating. But again, as a society, are we prepared to decrease consumption? I'd have to be highly doubtful that we are. I don't think a politician's ever stood up and discussed that and talked people through buying less for Christmas, or, decreasing the amount of stuff we consume, particularly coming out of COVID and trying to, get the economy moving again. A lot of people are encouraging shopping and retail spending, so it's almost moving in the opposite direction. But there's that old saying that things that can't continue must end, and this fundamentally must end. When it ends, who knows? But in the long term, in the medium term, we can't keep going with this scenario. We have to decrease the amount of materials that we need to recycle, or find a better way, a more efficient way of reusing or recycling them. Or fundamentally, if we don't do that, I would argue the only show in town potentially is incineration, which the Swedes and the Japanese use to at least get some benefit, economic, environmental and financial benefit from those materials. So my understanding is Sweden, for example, incinerates nearly all the waste it produces, and then they don't need to utilize as much fossil fuels. So it's a carbon, benefit to the environment. So, I think these are tough questions. I think these are questions that obviously I'm not going to answer today, and I don't think any of us, very few of us even ask the questions, let alone provide the answers. So as a longer term strategy, we look at that environmental conference in Glasgow. These are the questions I would like to see people discussing, as world trade increases again, and, hopefully the world gets back to some semblance of normality. People have talked about a new normal, etc., which is a term obviously that a lot of people disagree with, but I think we do need a new normal when it comes to recycling, to circular economy, to those aspects, because without it, it's just going to be, if we have this discussion again in 5 years, in 5 years, it'll just be a worse scenario. So, yeah, I think hiding from the truth, burying your head in the sand is never the right scenario. When you see problems, we have to discuss them and address them. So, yeah, I'll leave it there today. I'll be interested to hear, any listeners' feedback on this. But otherwise, like and subscribe, leave a review on any platforms you're on, because when we get reviews, that will help us, I believe, rank better in the algorithm with the podcast. And at the end of the day, we get more listeners, we build a bigger community. So thanks again, and I'll leave you with the slogan, recycle, don't be a waster.